Hey world history students, welcome to another video. It's Mr. Johnson, and I'll start out with a joke first. So a priest, a minister, and a rabbit all go to give blood. The priest comes up and says, I'm AB positive, so they let him in and everything. The minister comes up and she says, I'm A negative. And they, okay, cool, let her in. And the rabbit comes up and says, I think I'm a type O. Yep, okay. 8.3 Effects of the Cold War. After World War II, the Soviets and the Allies basically were fighting over how much land they would take over of Europe. And so there was a race to cover as much of Germany as possible by the Allies, even though Berlin is mostly in the east and easier to capture. The Soviets take Berlin first, and the Allies take most of the other parts of Germany. Because of this forms Germany into four sectors of administration: the Soviet, French, British, and American sectors. Now, this is how they divided not only Germany, but also Berlin, seeing as it's a major city and the major city of Germany. Now, the Soviets, every place that the Soviets liberate, as they say, became a communist government, whether the people there wanted one or not. The Soviets created a whole communist system out of all of these countries, whereas the Allies eventually will let them choose their own government, particularly in West Germany. So what comes to play is that this Cold War that starts, the first major test of who's going to do what, is that the Soviets blockade all of Western Berlin to all traffic coming in. So the Allies devise a plan to airlift supplies. And if you have the book or you have the online version of Edible History of Humanity, that would have been one of the chapters I gave you. It's a really good book to read, and that's really interesting stuff to see how all of this connects. If you have that book, I strongly suggest you read all of that just for good background knowledge, and also to be smarter and do Mr. Johnson proud. If you really want to live up to that, it's okay. No, I'm already proud of you. You guys are awesome. Okay, so anyway, because of this, it becomes a major cornerstone to the Cold War. And why? Because Germany had been defeated 3 years, it's 1948 is when it starts. 3 years prior, Germany was still in ruins after World War II, and all of Europe was still rebuilding from this major war. But here, we were looking at the Germans as allies and not as occupied people who lost a war. We brought them in and showed them we cared, and this became a major play in getting Germany back on its feet, as well as a member of the Allies, as well, which eventually be NATO. So this demonstrated that this was not anymore about an occupying force, but we're here to prevent the Soviets from getting more. And in a sense, it became a solidarity of, we are with you, German people. We did not abandon you. Our pilots would also drop candies and whatnot for kids as they go by. That's what you see in the picture in the bottom corner. So because of this, however, the Soviets then build, 11 months later, they stop the blockade, and they build a wall around West Berlin called the Berlin Wall. And that becomes another major symbol of the Cold War and what's going to play in terms of a divided Germany. That will not fall until 1989, and purely by accident, but that's a different story altogether. It's really cool, though. Anyway, here's a cool video.
1948, Berlin. Relations between Western Allies and the Soviet Union take a turn for the worse. In June, Soviet forces block access to Allied-controlled areas. The Russians want the entire city under communist control. It's the first international crisis of the Cold War. World War III is a very real threat. As the months go on, the situation gets worse. The Soviets appear to have the upper hand. Then the Allies come up with a novel plan. Airlift, food, milk, coal, gasoline. West Berliners need 35,000 tons of these supplies every single day. An airlift this big has never been done. The Soviets bet it never will. the Allies' plan gets off to a rocky start. Enter General William Tunner. Using a fleet of 225 C-54s, he hatches a plan to outsmart the Soviets. Tunner's airlift drops 2.3 million pounds of supplies. 11 months later, the Soviet Union lifts the blockade, its stranglehold on West Berlin defeated. In the Air Force, fighters and bombers are the shakers, but transport aircraft are the movers. Airlift is a key part of military planning.
Moving on. So, NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was built to stop or prevent growth or movement of the Soviet Pact, of the Warsaw Pact, which was all the Eastern European countries. Because of this, Churchill called this an Iron Curtain. That's the picture above me. That has descended on Europe in terms of which side is communist and what side is capitalist. Because of this, this will face off for the next 50 years. And it will organize the entire world around one or two camps and a third camp that tries. So this is NATO. Two other organizations that are created are CETO and CENTO, both in the respective regions as well.
In May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. This had been the price of Europe's unpreparedness. Our hard-won peace seemed at last secure. A few days before, Allied forces from the West had joined hands with the Russians from the East. Their statesmen had met cordially at Yalta and at Potsdam. They had agreed that the countries they had occupied should be truly liberated, and that freely elected governments should be set up as soon as possible. Russia had swallowed up 8 European countries without firing another shot. Great Britain and the United States protested that these countries had been coerced by threat of force, and that Russia had broken her treaty. But Russia ignored the protest. On April 4, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed between France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Norway, Denmark, Italy, Portugal, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. The pact was designed to keep within the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter. The treaty members realized that real peace is more than an absence of war, and they seek to promote political and economic stability in the North Atlantic area. To ensure this, they are sworn to stand together against aggression. An attack against one would be an attack against all. This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO.
So the next part is, these are called proxy wars. A proxy war is where two sides aren't fighting each other directly, but they do it through other means. And so this is how most of the Cold War will be fought. We never actually fight the communist Soviet Union. We fight their allies, and their allies fight our allies, and that's how it plays out. Now, those of you who love history and really want to go way back in time to a really cool book, The Peloponnesian War by Donald Kagan, I strongly recommend. There's even a Cold War that's very similar to this between Athens and Sparta. I never thought I'd really get into the whole ancient Greek history stuff, but it's some good stuff if you're really going in for it. So, anyway, one of the first places where there's a war that threatens the growth of communism is in Korea. Divided to the 38th parallel, the North Korean forces invade South Korea unprovoked and without warning, all the way down to the Pusan Triangle, and the United States and the UN forces under General Douglas MacArthur decide to do a two-pronged counterattack. First from pushing out from Pusan, and the Marines would invade from the Incheon and cut off North Koreans and push them all the way back. Now, MacArthur was also realizing that China is going to be a problem and said, let's go into China right now. We can do this. We got nukes. Let's use those. Let's keep going. And yeah, no, it's bad to escalate a war beyond the scope of what it was intended to. The problem is the Chinese claim that the United States crossed the Yalu River, and because of that, the Chinese invade and create the next phase of the war, where it pushes them all the way back down before Seoul, and eventually the United States and UN forces push back and create that border of what it is today. It's now called the Armistice Line because we signed an armistice, which means it's a ceasefire. We are technically still at war with North Korea. And because of that line, it's a 3-mile long demilitarized zone riddled with landmines. And because of that, the United States will not sign any landmine ban treaty because we are responsible for all those mines. So that's how Korea, the war, in a sense, ended, even though it's technically not over yet. Next up is Vietnam. This brings up a lot because it's still within memories. I believe for you all, it's probably your grandparents, as it's my parents that were living at the later end of it. Dad wouldn't have been eligible till 1972 for a draft. But looking at this from a history perspective 50 years later, we did this to stop the spread of communism. We had this very real understanding that when communism spread, it would go into other countries and make the world dangerous for us. That
Domino theory has very little to do with dominoes, and even less to do with pizza. Instead, it deals with the spread of communism throughout the world. It was said that if one nation adopted communism, so too would nearby nations, one after the other after the other. While he never trademarked the term domino theory, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first person to use the analogy during a 1954 news conference. In a time when communism was seen in much of the West as an immense evil, the idea of country after country falling to the communists was terrifying to many Americans. Most fears centered around Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, and domino theory provided a convenient reason for the United States to get involved in police actions in the region to prevent the spread of communism. Although maybe it'd be better if we solved our problems over a real game of dominoes instead.
Getting elected president is an expensive business. Campaign costs add up. There are advertisements to make, travel expenses, convention costs, even bumper stickers. But where does all this money come from?
the United States could not prosper with communist countries. And so any attack on non-communist countries was an attack on us because we could lose having those supports and those allies. So we decided to support South Vietnam against the North Vietnamese incursion, first supplying them with training and then full-on American troops involved. Other countries also came to our aid as well. From 1964 to 1975 it waged. We left in 1975, and the country was then overrun by North Vietnam. There's a lot of stuff out there you can watch on your own. I'm not getting too far into this. I want this video kind of short. So, Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs. This is from the Museum of La Playa Giron, which is the Bay of Pigs. I've been there when I went to Cuba in 2017. What happened was we supported these Cubans that wanted to overthrow the current or just newly developed Cuban communist government. And first planned under Eisenhower, it was executed in 1961 under Kennedy, and it was a complete disaster. The United States did not support them as much as they promised, and the Cuban military, even though it was very poorly equipped, was easily able to stop the invasion. And it became basically a sign of anti-imperialism, of Cubans triumphing over the enemy. They really don't like us, and we've done a lot of things to earn that. And I don't say this in support of the Cuban Revolution or any of that. The United States supported a lot of right-wing governments and overthrew a lot of people in Central and South America in defense of our way of life, of stopping communism. Anytime there was a left-leaning elected leader, we found a general who could overthrow them. That happened particularly, two examples, in Guatemala in 1954 and in 1972 in Chile with Augusto Pinochet overthrowing Allende. So we saw that Latin America had to be not communist, and we would support anyone we could. Because of that, we supported an El Salvadoran civil war that lasted for 20 years. We supported all kinds of stuff. 11 years. Because of all of that, we supported governments that were really not that good. We supported the government during the El Salvador Civil War, which was particularly messy. So that's some of the decisions we made to make our country safe. And we're still paying for them now, as a lot of these Central American countries in particular are not very well established and kind of failing. All right, Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, we had missiles in Turkey that were pointed at the Soviet Union. They decided it's a fair deal then to put missiles in Cuba and point them at us. We saw this as an act of war. We blockaded Cuba. And so for 13 days, we were worried that we would have a major nuclear war. And after a 13-day standoff, the Soviets backed down, dismantled their weapons, and brought them back. We agreed to take the ones down out of Turkey and promised never to try to invade Cuba again. So, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because of that, we wanted to create a direct line or a hotline between the United States president and the Russian premier. Now, you might think, like, let's just get their phone number. I mean, you're right. But I know you've seen the old switchboards and stuff. In the old days, you had to patch a line through. They connected the wires of one caller to another. And so they had to do this over and over to connect all of these wires to get one wire connected one way or another from Washington, D.C. to Moscow. So we erected basically a direct line from one to the other. Also, because of this, the world realized that they were very close to nuclear war starting. And because of this, two new treaties come about within the next 10 years. First is a test ban treaty in 1963 that the United States and 100 other countries would no longer test nuclear weapons. So there's some lovely pictures of them. Secondly, we then agreed to a non-proliferation treaty, which meant we were no longer going to produce and make more nukes as an agreement. Other wars that were included later were in Angola. There was a three-way civil war that lasted from 1975 to roughly the 1990s and then 2002. There was also lots of little tiny wars and fights in Central America, particularly in Nicaragua with the Contras. Not going to get too far into that. I just want to keep this video brief. But because of all of this, there was also this movement, this peace movement against global war, and realizing that humanity now has the ability to completely wipe itself off the face of this earth. And that's bad, obviously. So that's one of the first the first beginnings of environmentalism as well as anti-nuclear weapons. So that's the video today. I wanted to keep it short and brief with some pretty pictures. So yeah, have a good one, and let me know what you think. Laters.
I found a natural corn dog out in the wild. Let's taste it.